This video is brought to you by the Native Oak and has been sponsored by Native. The causes of the American War of Independence were many and nuanced. Some righteous, others less so, but I can unfortunately say with confidence that a great deal of them are severely misunderstood. For many people today, when asked to describe why taxation was among those causes, you might expect the answer to sound something like this god-awful meme that I see spewed all over Facebook every single year. Pay insane taxes to cover our reckless debt. A soldier orders a rebel, which the latter is none too pleased about. And I hate to say it, but even those who are more loyally inclined, righteously so, will regularly make the same mistake. This is our debt from the 7 Years' War, which we fought to protect you. Now it's time to pay our debts, so we need to raise your taxes. The modern loyalist may emphasize a more reasonable nature to the taxes, but in this narrative they are still being imposed for the same reason. That being to have the colonies contribute their share to help pay off the national debt which was so dramatically increased by the 7 Years' War. Now, absolutely, the eye-watering level of debt that the British government was facing certainly meant that they needed to expand their revenues. But what if I told you that far from using the American colonies as a great cash cow to ease British burdens, as is the popular conception these days, it was in fact the Americans who were largely being subsidized by the British, and that not a single American penny was being sent to alleviate British debt? Well, break out your calculators, my friend, because in this video we're going to be going through some numbers, and in the course of it we'll learn a little bit more about the nature of British imperial government and, of course, of the causes of the American War of Independence. After the 7 Years' War had ended, the British Empire emerged supreme with vast new territories in the Far East and the New World. It opened new markets to British industry, and her commerce was dramatically expanded under the protection of an ascendant Royal Navy. You know, the French Navy is still there, but the Royal Navy is starting to really come into its own. But the success, of course, had come at a high price, as they always do. Oh, and I'm not talking about the lives, I'm talking about the cash. At the start of 1763, when the 7 Years' War ended, yeah, I got that one wrong in my last video. It was a really stupid, silly mistake on my part. I apologize about that. But 1763, the British national debt numbered around 122,603,336 pounds sterling, double that of its pre-war amount. At an interest rate of around 3% a year, that means that a tad over £3.5 million a year is being paid by the British government in interest alone. Now, obviously, historical economic statistics can be really tricky things, especially when we're talking about these sorts of super specific numbers. So we really need to take all of this with a healthy dose of salt. But by most measures that I could find, and I'll be sure to include the sources for the ones that I'm actually using here down below, the total debt figure was around 120 to 135 or so million pounds. The 3% figure for the interest that I'm using comes from immediately after the Revolutionary War, but I think it's also a fair, if again very rough, estimation to use. Most secondary sources I saw also seem to agree that interest payments could represent at their highest about half of all government expenditures, which is a lot. It's needless to say, the British are in a tricky situation, financially speaking. The British nation may have won all of these beautiful new markets and commercial opportunities to exploit, but at this point, they really pale in comparison to just how much the government, which doesn't really benefit all too directly from a lot of those new commercial opportunities and whatnot, not directly, how much the government is having to spend to actually pay for all of those new opportunities. Certainly, if there were ever an environment to raise taxes in order to pay off those debts and actually start benefiting, indeed, from all that increased commerce, well, now would be the time. This would be it. But as we shall see, the British purse had far more to occupy itself with than mere financing. So next, let's talk about defense, conveniently, of course, right after a word from our sponsor. Hey, man, I was just heading out to... Hey, you all right there? Yeah, I'm fine. Just trying to figure out how to do this sponsored message from Native. Native? Yeah, they sell like, deodorant, body wash, toothpaste, and stuff like that. It's actually pretty good stuff. It smells really good, and it doesn't, stick or anything. It dries quickly if I'm ever, in a rush, have to get out of the house really quick. What are you talking about? You never actually leave the house. Well, anyways, what's the problem with the product? Oh no, there's no problem with the actual product. I mean, I've been using it the past couple days. It helps me feel nice and refreshed, clean. The scent, it sticks around all day, even after I'm moving around and building furniture and whatnot. Actually, I still need to figure out what I'm going to do about this blank wall behind me here. Ah, that explains why you've been smelling so great lately. What? Anyways, no. Why you look so stressed out then? Well, I mean, it's a great sponsorship. It's just that they want me to actually show myself applying the product, all shirtless and such. Well, what's the big deal? Why not? I mean, I certainly wouldn't mind. I mean, I could go on for a hot minute about how nice it all smells. Like the refreshingly smooth powder and cotton, or the delicious coconut and vanilla, and of course the refined and genteel Earl Grey and mulberry. They have such a great range of different products and scents and everything. They even actually have a plastic-free line where it's all the same stuff, same formulas, just with way more sustainable packaging. It's just that, I mean, my arms, my underarms? Yeah, I still really don't get the hang up here, but I don't know. Do you have anything else you can talk about in place of that in the ad where they'll still approve it? Like a discount code or something? You think if I mention how you can use code BRANDONF at checkout to get 33% off deodorants and 20% off body washes and toothpaste, that it'll be enough for them to accept my ad submission without my having to show myself putting it on? I'm actually starting to get an idea on how I might be able to do this advertisement. You want to be an unpaid actor for me? I don't know, man. This is starting to get a little bit too meta for me. I think I'm just gonna head on out. Anyways, thank you to Native for sponsoring this video. By 1775, being a few good years after the war had ended and the military had scaled itself back down to peacetime levels, the entirety of the British Empire had about 50,000 soldiers. 16,000 of these men, the single largest chunk of them, were in Great Britain itself. A further 12,500 were in Ireland. 8,500 men garrisoned the North American mainland, with a further 1,900 in the West Indies, for a combined total of around 10,500 in the New World. The remainder of the army represented smaller garrisons, scattered all around, Gibraltar, Minorca, India, all around, so on and so forth, places like that. But naturally, we want to focus on that 10,000 in America, and more specifically the 8,000 or so in the mainland. Why were they there? And was this a particularly large force? Well, as far as many colonists were concerned, yes, this was a very large force, far more than was necessary for the colonies, which were, on their own merits, immensely wealthy and capable, so they often claimed, of defending themselves. From the colonist perspective, the presence of this standing army was merely because the British didn't want to dismiss so many officers who probably had connections back home in Parliament. After all, it's not like the French were a threat anymore, were they? And the colonies were really capable of defending themselves from any native threats. As he always did, Benjamin Franklin put it quite frankly when he was examined by the House of Commons in 1766. Quote, "Question. Is it not necessary to send troops to America to defend the Americans against the Indians?" And Ben Franklin's answer came, "No, by no means. It was never necessary. They defended themselves when they were but a handful and the Indians much more numerous. They continually gained ground and had driven the Indians over the mountains without any troops being sent to their assistance from this country," being Great Britain. And can it be thought necessary now to send troops for their defense against those diminishing Indian tribes when the colonies are become so populous and so strong? There is not the least occasion for it. They are very able to defend themselves. Of course, from the British perspective, this was a paltry garrison to defend, to occupy such vast swaths of territory. The 13 colonies alone represented some 400,000 square miles of land, and that doesn't even begin to include the newly conquered Florida or any of the massive, truly massive Canadian holdings. Compare that to Great Britain at 80,000 square miles or Ireland at only 32,000, and remember that each of those countries had significantly larger garrisons. So indeed, it seems that the army barely had any presence in North America at all, again, at least when compared to other possessions. Now, admittedly, yes, the population of North America was also smaller. Great Britain's population in the 1770s or thereabouts was a little under 10 million. It was like 8.5, something like that, million. Whereas the 13 colonies only had about 2.5 million non-natives, that is, including some 500,000 slaves. But on the other hand, the other side of things, that population was also a lot more varied. Alongside, obviously, the English, there were large settlements of Germans. There were newly conquered Frenchmen, of course, Scots and Irish, all sorts of different religious communities like the Moravians. And then, of course, again, you have the natives, not included in that count, and Black Americans. The potential tensions there between the populations, I feel that I need not explain. And the garrison is not only there to protect the colonists from outside forces, like outside native raids or the French or something like that, it's also there to ensure that the colonists are maintaining peace among themselves, and particularly racial violence between Native American populations and, well, the colonists, something that we'll touch on a little bit later on with a rebellion that took place shortly after the 7 Years' War. And this disparate, or at least they're relatively disparate when compared with, say, the English population of England, the population was also incredibly thinly spread. The largest colonial city, Philadelphia, had about 43,000 people out of 2.5 million. Next largest was New York at 25,000, and then you have Boston at 16,000. Meanwhile, again, let's look at the garrison of 8,500 British soldiers on the continent. Evenly divided, which obviously they would not be evenly divided. It's just a useful way to get a sense for the scale of all this, I think. But if you did evenly divide them among all the different colonies, you'd get around 660 men per colony. Talk about thinly spread. While many colonists may have looked at those numbers as unnecessary and oppressive, honestly, I would look at them and wonder if Britain was really affording the 13 colonies the same dignity of protection that they deserved, the same level of defense that they really required, given, again, how many other parts of the empire were so much better defended, without having to rely on their own resources. And while it's true that the French threat was largely pacified by this point, and the Spanish, they still have a massive North American empire, but they're hardly likely to attack the 13 colonies, all the same, there are still threats, namely coming from Native American rebellions, uprisings, and conflicts. Or at least so followed the British argument, which obviously, again, I am more inclined to believe. And shortly after the 7 Years' War, one such rebellion did take place, Pontiac's War. It took 3,000 men, admittedly it was a small number of them British regulars, and they were primarily militiamen, to fend the Seneca off, but only after the Seneca had managed to capture 8 different British forts. It cost the British colonies over 800 dead, and thousands of them turned refugee when their homes were destroyed, to say nothing, of course, of the destruction on the Native Americans' part, but we're talking from the British perspective here, not objectively. Now, in fairness, a large portion of that destruction was due to the British not properly preparing. They underestimated their enemies. They only ever sent a small portion of the overall garrison to actually deal with that problem. But all the same, if only 3,000 natives would wreak such havoc, then I dare say that having, well, at least some sort of garrison in North America is still pretty important for them. It's a pretty good idea. It just goes to show that 8,000 for the entirety of the continent really wasn't a lot. Maybe if they had instead sent 1,000 or 2,000 to deal with Pontiac at first, rather than a few hundred, they would have saved themselves a lot of trouble in the long run. And even if you would argue that 8,000 is unnecessary, well, okay, fine. But how many soldiers is a reasonable amount? 4,000? Maybe only 2? Well, that force of 3,000 natives we see in Pontiac's War is starting to sound scarier the more you reduce those numbers, to say nothing, again, of if the French did decide to stop by again for a visit. Whatever your number is for what you think a fair garrison would be, keep it in mind, because we're about to put all this together and finally arrive at my point. The cost to maintain the British garrison, necessary or not, was roughly £200,000 a year. A drop in the bucket, of course, when compared to the millions in interest alone on the British debt. And of course, that isn't including other expenses related to controlling and policing and defending the empire, like the naval presence. All those ships required to protect American and British shipping both, which is so vital to American industry and commerce and whatnot, definitely cost a pretty penny, and they aren't included in that 200,000 figure. That's only the infantry, really, only the army garrison. As well as, again, policing to the extent that it existed at least. We have the salaries of governors, customs officials, and other civil servants, and all the rest. You get the idea. There are a lot of different expenses that go into maintaining an empire. So with that in mind, how much do we suspect that the various taxes the British government introduced were intended to raise? Say £3 million. Enough to obviously have the Americans paying for their own defense and their administration, while still contributing a healthy chunk towards that £3 or £4 million interest payment, while the Brits themselves are still paying the remainder of the interest and then able to tackle the premium. Maybe £1.5 million, able to contribute a solid portion of the interest that way, while still paying their own way. Maybe just £1 million? Oh, well, surely at least £500,000 can be raised. That way, something can be put towards the interest. At least the Americans are, paying for themselves, while the home country, the mother country, is financially aflame. The Stamp Act, passed 1764, repealed 1766, was intended to raise approximately £60,000 a year. In actuality, it only actually raised around £4,000. The Sugar Act, passed 1765, repealed 1766, actually saw the duty on molasses imports halved in an attempt to improve collection rates. It was intended to raise £79,000 a year and similarly failed. The Tea Act also actually lowered tea prices in an attempt to discourage smuggling alongside providing an economic boon to the East India Company, but I think we all know how that one also failed. New taxes on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The Quartering Act, to attempt to have the colonists aid towards the cost of housing and feeding the soldiers. Dramatically expanded powers to local customs officials and anti-smuggling operations. The Townshend Acts were all intended to raise about £40,000. Insane, outrageous taxation to barely even approach defraying the most basic expense of the empire, its protection. I'll say it again, the cost for the army presence alone was £200,000 a year. You could have the garrison, 4,000 men across the entire lot, and still none of these taxes, even if they worked completely, would be sufficient to pay for them all. And remember all of the expenses that, again, we are not including in this figure. The Navy, customs services, and civil services, the government itself. A far cry from the British greedily tearing away at American property and industry to subsidize their bloody wars of conquest, as it is certainly believed by many today. These taxes represent the British, who were in a potentially economically ruinous state, desperately trying to at least get some relief towards the cost of maintaining, let alone keeping, their empire. So at long last I come to my conclusion, and I promise that I'll make it quick. Despite what is commonly believed, the British were hardly taxing the Americans to pay off their debts, and they were especially not trying to use the Americans as some imperial gold mine, extracting as much wealth as they could so the aristocrats could sit wealthy and idle back at home. The financial situation of the empire was tenuous at best, and government was desperate to raise revenue across the board one way or another. The American colonies, far from being this profitable expansion that was won in the war, was costing more than they made. Maybe not for the wealthy American merchants or the gentlemen farmers, and certainly not for the smugglers, of which there were an awful many of them, but certainly for the state. And for the Americans' part, were they simply blind to all this? Were they too greedy to care? Well, a part of me honestly does say, back in the mind, yeah, kind of a little bit. But by far, I think the larger and perhaps more academically honest answer is a one not so much of practicality and of immediate material concern, so much as it is a one of ideology and of principle, And I hope that you all know to what I refer by that. For the primary sticking point, for so many of the American colonists, at least those who are making all the writings, those who are egging the population on to revolt, it's not a question of taxation and debts, but a one of representation and their rights as Englishmen. Thank you for watching, my dear viewer, and until the next time, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.